Now today we are doing lecture 3, chapter 4, Dim and the Hypothesis. I'm actually going to tell you what my hypothesis is, which I did not in the course that I gave. The fundamental means by which philosophy shapes man's life is its power to shape the action of his consciousness. Philosophy, and specifically epistemology, is the science which teaches man how to use his mind. In other words, how and whether to think. A man's ideas, emotions, and actions proceed from his thought or non-thought. Well, if the essence of thought is integration, as I've been saying, then we can come to a certain hypothesis that philosophy shapes man's mind primarily by teaching him how and whether to integrate. Philosophers do this job by defining and championing the modes of integration implicit in their own basic approaches. Now, keep this term in mind, mode of integration. I use that throughout the book to subsume any of the consistent possibilities, including opposition to integration. So it's a shorthand way of saying all the different forms, methods, and approaches to integration. Good, bad, valid, invalid, or anti. Now these modes are the creator of the creators of a culture. In other words, the adoption of one or another of them shapes the mental functioning of the innovators and movers of a culture in art, science, education, politics, and many other fields. The three giants of Western philosophy, as we have seen, have defined three fundamentally different approaches to integration, each corresponding to one of the three alternatives in this regard that are possible to man. Plato counseled a philosophic form of invalid integration, Aristotle of valid integration, Kant of the rejection of integration. And this is the source of my threefold classification of modes of integration. So I call the Platonic mode misintegration, or for short, M. I call the Aristotelian mode simply integration, I. And the Kantian mode disintegration, D. And in order to refer to all three modes at once, I have coined the acronym DIM. Now, the order of the letters in this term is actually the reverse of the historical development. And moreover, it might suggest some loss of light or even of intelligence. But the only alternative is mid, M-I-D. And in my mind, that is even worse, because it might suggest that there's a virtue in being middle of the road or moderate. And there's no other combination of those three letters that can be pronounced, etc. Now, my symbolism, of course, has to accommodate the two variants that we identified after the three archetypes. So I have divided D and M. I call the knowing skeptics D1, and that's as against the pure Kantian D2. And I call the worldly supernaturalists M1 as against the pure Platonic M2. So we have a total of 5 possibilities in regard to integrative modes. Now, when you see a 1, or hear me say a 1, whether D1 or M1, that indicates a fundamental agreement with the mode of the corresponding 2, along with important, even though not fundamental, disagreements, which situate these two differently in relation to I, differently than their D2 or M2 counterparts. D1 thinkers are no champions of integration, but they are not its principal enemies either. They counsel disintegration in general as unavoidable, but they uphold the quest for integration in specific areas. M1 thinkers, coming from the other axis, counsel misintegration in general as truth, but uphold the quest for valid integration in specific areas. Now, a long discussion here on where these categories do and don't apply. First of all, dim categories presuppose basic philosophy, but cannot be used to classify a philosophy. The categories derive from philosophy. Those who lay the foundations of methodical thought, in other words, the philosophers, are obviously not guided by their adoption of dim models. On the contrary, they are the source of the models. So you can't say Plato is M. Plato created M. He's the father of M. Now, the only way in which you can validly apply the dim categories to basic philosophy is if you have the opposite meaning. Not dim as the source of philosophic principles, but those principles as the source of dim. So in that sense, you can say Aristotle's metaphysics and epistemology is I, but only in the sense that he laid the bases and defined the nature of the I mode of integration, and thereby made possible its deliberate acceptance by others. But in terms of its purpose, the dim perspective is a classification not of philosophies, but of their application to human life. Not of philosophies, but of their application to human life. And by which I mean their application to certain specific cultural issues that we all recognize as critical to our life. These issues are decided for a society by creators in the cultural field. And they do it. They enforce it, implement their decisions and spread it by fashioning definite kinds of products. Products which exhibit a definite epistemological essence and pedigree, if we can put it that way. So if you want an analogy, philosophy is to culture what physics is to engineering. In both cases, the first is the abstract theory, crucial but invisible to most men, while the second is its existential appearance and practical use in men's lives. And we are concerned with the second, with engineering approach here. Philosophy does not rule the world by its mere statement. It rules by means of what such statements actually do to the minds and thus the products of cultural creators. Now, by products, I have nothing esoteric in mind. I mean entities such as novels and plays, systems or anti-systems of physicists, nurseries and schools, governmental and legal systems, and the like. The sum of such products is what constitutes a culture. And philosophy does not rule the world like a dictator by instilling a mode of integration into unknowing pawns, who then proceed willy-nilly to implement it in their work. On the contrary, a mode of integration is too complex a phenomenon to be practiced with any consistency unless a man knows and endorses it in some terms as his mental guide. Dim products are not accidental. They reflect an intellectual commitment. In other words, a creator's acceptance as a thinking adult or anti-thinking adult of a certain mental method. Now, he may not know its full definition, its philosophic roots, its philosophic implications, But he does know, if he comes under dim, the essence of his method's application to his own field. And he is convinced that it is indispensable to his own work. I'm going to make one exception to this in the next lecture, but I'm not even going to tell you what it is now. Because he does grasp its importance, a cultural creator, here I mean creator is not necessarily good or bad, just innovator, start something that wasn't there before. A cultural creator is usually eager to defend his distinctive method of thought, especially against the outcries of its critics and of opposing schools, which he is usually eager to attack. In any event, if he does remain silent, and at the time is ideologically ripe, a legion of vocal defenders soon springs to his aid. A significant cultural product, therefore, rarely, sometimes, but rarely remains an unidentified artifact. In some explicit terms, its epistemological soul is broadcast to anyone who cares to listen. Now, very often the defenders, like the creators themselves, don't cover every important aspect, not even of all the relevant issues. And they rarely use technical terms like rationalism or idealism. But as long as the case is offered as it is, in clear, even though popular and abridged terms, the philosophically literate can easily fill in the blanks. Now, I have been connecting two elements in the above, the products and their defenses, because only the union of these two can have cultural significance. A product whose animating premises were left merely implicit, in other words, unidentified in words, consciously unknown by men, and therefore not only defended, but also indefensible in any proper terms against the onslaught of vocal competitors, such a product could have only a relatively short and inconsequential life in the West. Its distinctive approach and ideas could not become an influence if no one gave them voice. On the other hand, abstract speeches alone, even within a specific field, are not yet its engineering. They can have power in a society only if they define and advocate a specific type of product. Hence the necessity in cultural analysis of seeking out the combination of product and defense. Now, the importance of this combination is eloquently illustrated in the uncommon cases in which there is a contradiction between the two elements. To take the romantic novelists of the early 19th century, largely untutored in philosophy, were actually relying, as we'll see next time, on every aspect of the mode of Aristotle while denouncing him and even his mode of integration. Even though the actual integrative nature of their products was clear, you didn't have to guess, it leaps out at you from reading it if you know anything, and it was popular, widely popular, that contradiction undermined its defenders, diluted their influence, put them on the side of their antagonists, and soon wiped out the whole movement. The product in this kind of case should still be subsumed under dim for what it is, but it is important in cultural analysis to identify in such a case the fact that its defense is contradictory, and therefore its influence and its longevity are severely going to be undercut. So to identify the modes of integration underlying and shaping our culture, what do? We have to first choose representative fields and then analyze in dim terms their characteristic products and the intellectual defense of these offered by their champions. So now you can get the full unqualified definition of dim, and this one I'll actually pause for you to take down. Modes of integration which, comma, applied and upheld within a given cultural field, comma, lead to a distinctive type of product within that field. Each of the D, D1, whatever, is a type of integration, a mode, a way of integrating, used within a specific field, not philosophy in general, and used to create a distinctive type of product within that field. If there's no product, there's no dim. And if there's just the upholding of a way of thinking, there's no dim. Now you can extend the terminology of dim, as I do for convenience, in all kinds of ways. You can use it to refer to a mode in the abstract, the I mode, whatever, or to the more specific ideas of those who champion its practice within a cultural area, or to the champions themselves. You know, I can say Kandinsky is D2, and you know, without going through his products and as a shorthand. And all of these are interconnected aspects of a single cultural process. So you'll hear me talk about a politician's M2 ideas, and you'll see that that has to be part of a conclusion or a political system which reflects a certain mode of integration. And sometimes I abbreviate even further by harmlessly hypothesizing and say, D1 claims, but M1 answers. I trust that you get, you know, what the long sentence would be if I said it. Now, very important here, in conducting a dim analysis, one must know not only what facts are relevant to it, but also which facts are not. Something I didn't make clear or even clearly get myself when I gave the course. There are two categories of irrelevant facts that I want to leave out in any analysis. First, since dim identifies a mind's epistemological commitment, it is not a psychological classification. It has no relation to psychology. I'll elaborate that in a moment, but I just want to say, second, it does not apply to men who are non-intellectual. Now let's talk about for a moment why it's not psychological. A mode of integration is not necessarily connected to any specific type of motives, childhood, or character. The dim question is, how does a man choose to think? What is his policy of integration on the conscious level? Not how does his subconscious operate. We're going by what he creates and by what he says, and not by what his mother did to him when he was 3. Or not even by what he really wants to do or he didn't do it. Each mode of integration, as you'll see, is frequently favored, most of them, by men of a certain type. But every one of them can and has been adopted and praised by many different kinds of men for different reasons and with different and even opposite kinds of psychology. But in regard to cultural analysis, all these variations are irrelevant. It is the publicly embodied and upheld modes of thought that affect men's course, not anyone's inner traumas or private feelings. Now, the latter can certainly lead an individual wordlessly to love or hate a certain kind of product or movement. But his feelings have no cultural power until, if he can, he finds the words to give them meaning and support. And then it's what he says publicly, what he defends, that has the influence, if he's going to have influence, not what's raging in his breast. Now, I want to concretize this point by supposing for a moment, as some really disgusting Nazi apologists do, that Hitler denounced the Jews only for political gain, but admired them privately and gassed them in the belief that this would deliver them to a Teutonic heaven. Now, of course, that is beyond nonsensical. But the point is this: even if there were this inner Hitler, nothing in German culture or Western history would have been affected by it, whether it was there or whether it wasn't. The 6 million would still be dead, while the method of thought that killed them would still be alive. So if you found this out, it would be of utterly no significance. It would be like there was an impotent ghost. Well, so what influence does an impotent ghost? I mean, it might have a religious influence on certain religions for a while, then they had to triple it. All right. Now let's go to the second point. The exclusion from DIM of men who are non-intellectual in their approach to life and work. By definition, the products of such men do not reflect their choice of any mode of integration. By the nature of the human mind, everyone who doesn't stay on the total insect level practices some form of integration some of the time. You can't get out of bed without that. But most people have no idea that they are doing so, that there's any alternative to what they're doing, that they have any power of self-direction in this regard. Being followers, they merely copy fragments of some way of thought unknowingly, in fits and starts, usually by osmosis from others, which they don't identify. Now, minds such as this have no epistemological identity and therefore are culturally impotent. To be subsumable under DIM, a man cannot be innocent of ideas, whether that happens through ignorance, disinterest, and or disdain. The DIM categories apply only to the movers among men. In other words, to the relatively small group who are conscious of the importance of certain epistemological issues. It does not apply to the moved. In other words, the malleable and inconstant masses, if they merely respond as and when pushed. A dim analysis of a culture, therefore, would not be helped one whit by an interview of millions of persons, even if you stratified by age, race, socioeconomic status, attitude to backgammon, etc. For cultural understanding and prediction, you would learn much more by taking a tour of Harvard, or the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or the Senate Judiciary Committee, than you would from the millions and millions polled by Gallup. Now, I want to develop this point by distinguishing some true DIM products and attitudes from seemingly allied but actually non-DIM phenomena. Now, let's take the concept of D, for example. That does not apply to the output of most people who are concrete bound owing to a lack of mental effort and cognitive ambition, and who know nothing about the issues of epistemology. Such people come under no integrative category. They're not D. They don't integrate, but they're not D, and they have no cultural influence. In dim terms, they are zero. If you want, you can think of them as non-integrators rather than anti-integrators. They have no opinion about integration. They just don't do it. So somebody who walks around in a daze and doesn't integrate is not D. This type of non-integration requires no philosophic guidance. It's just what you do if you're ignorant or lazy. It's age-old. It's far, far before philosophy, and therefore has nothing to do with what we're talking about. A true D would be a man who practiced concrete boundedness deliberately on intellectual grounds. For instance, he might say generalizations are simplistic, they're misleading, we've got to get rid of them and deal with each problem as a unique case. Now that's a D. He's against integration. It's not just he wanders around in a daze and doesn't make connections. Now take the I category. A true I is a man who deliberately accepts the essentials of a rational epistemology. The products of such a man will be I. In other words, they'll be valid because they'll be rationally integrated. But the point here is that the converse is not true. Not all valid products are I. Not all valid or even admirable or great products are I. A scientist, for example, may perform a perfectly methodologically valid, fact-based experiment out of context while regarding the experimental method itself as merely a technical skill that he learned in college and is popular among his colleagues. He may be unaware of any ideas pertaining to cognition that are involved in his action. He just knows you keep these variables constant, and you vary this one, and you write up the report on this form, and you hand it in, and then you become an associate professor instead of an assistant. Now, thanks to the work of Galileo and others who are true I's, a valid method can be imitated today within limits by anyone, even by people who don't have any philosophy. They just copy the products of others. Now, such an imitator and his product are zero, again, in dim terms. They do not reflect an approach to integration. They're epistemological and cultural dead ends and would have no influence unless Galileo or the like were to take up the work into his own thinking. In other words, he'd have to then integrate the new data to relevant knowledge in the field, and then it would be his influence and his creativity that would move that into the mainstream and affect the culture, rather than just have it as another entry in the 10 trillion unrelated experiments that we're already drowning in. Now let's look at M for a minute. I'm not giving you all the false candidates, but just enough to, strip out some obvious confusions. Now you can say that M's in a broad sense are religious, but the M category cannot be equated with religion. There are countless religious men throughout history and prehistory who have accepted sincerely the dogmas, rituals, and leaders of some religion, and have done so without the benefit of any abstract ideas or even any interest in understanding what they are doing. Now, such men fall outside of any dim category. And a further point, even a deeply philosophically religious person is not necessarily M For example, Thomas Aquinas. Religion considered out of context, like any other viewpoint or idea, like pacifism, or the prohibition of smoking, or the opposition to the war in Iraq, you cannot take any one thing like that and say, what is it in dim terms? Because the classification, if any applies, depends on the methodology, the mode of integration used to reach and validate the idea. And it's usually difficult to determine that if there isn't some substantial epistemological pedigree. So people say to me, what does this poem by Wordsworth come under? Is it D or M? I can't tell you. I'd have to know. How does that fit into his corpus? What does he say? What else? Are his poems? Who does he admire? Who does he defend? I can't take 14 lines of an ode and say, well, his scheme was A-B-A-B, so he must be D. Religion belongs under M only if it is accepted as the fundamental mode of integrating human data on every subject. Religion. Now, I would say, to point to today's Christian fundamentalists, and of the great many of them, even though there's millions and millions, the great many of them, I believe, whether we're talking about leaders or laymen, are true M's. And that is because they explicitly endorse the mode of integration of Augustine. They may be awash on the surface in all kinds of concrete bound scriptural feuds and details. They may be very primitive, as they are, in their intellectual formulations. But they do demand explicitly, and they're just about the only group that do, all embracing integration. They won't let you say, well, forget about religion, let's discuss cosmology, or forget about it, let's discuss biology. They have a view of life which must include everything, all the way down to rock music. And they believe that the ultimate source of this is a spiritual supernatural unity which you discover not by observation but by turning away from this world and having faith in the abstract formulations of the Bible. That is a perfect M2 example. So it's not always true, my earlier implication, that there's a few leaders and the rest are nothing. In that particular movement, there are millions and millions who qualify as being true M2s. All right, I think we've established then that the actual representatives of the dim modes can't be defined in terms of out-of-context mental processes, statements, actions, or achievements. Let's summarize it this way. The mind classifiable under dim belongs to a man with an intellectual bent and a guiding idea. The bent enables him to consider methodological questions, and the idea is his answer to these, which determines his dim status. Now, I want to mention just in passing here that so far I've referred only to complete pure cases of what's dim or what isn't. But there is such a thing, I don't think it's that influential, but just to mention for accuracy, as mixed cases. Now, by mixed here, I do not mean somebody like Aristotle, because his essentials are consistent from beginning to end. The mixture is just the carryover of his predecessor and teacher, which is easily stripped off. But a mixed case, in the sense I mean, is one in which the creator chooses contradictory modes for essential aspects, different essential aspects of his product. So his product reflects a conflict between one mode and another in its essentials, not just in some stuff left over that you can easily strip off. So it's the choice of a contradiction, not a mere oversight or error. And you can see it always within the product itself. You go to an educator, for example, and you follow him around as he teaches. He follows the positivist mode in teaching history, but the Platonic mode in teaching math, which is extremely, extremely common. Or you see dramatists who present brilliantly integrated characters enacting random, utterly non-integrated events. Or the very common one, a physicist who follows, this is perhaps dominant in the field, a physicist who follows the Aristotelian mode in studying the macroscopic world, but the Kantian in studying subatomic particles. Now that is, just a tremendous contradiction. And in most cases, those who adopt such combinations try to justify them usually through some form of compartmentalization. One is this type of study and one is this type of study, and you don't relate history to math or subatomic particles to tables and chairs. Those are just two different things, that's it. Now, just to be fully comprehensive, I just want to literally, in a sentence, add that there's mixed cases of even a different kind, where the author consciously chooses a dim mode in one key aspect of a product, but no modes at all in the others. In which others, he just does whatever he feels like, whenever he feels like it. Now, this has no cultural influence, but if you're trying to classify, the perfect example here would be John Eric Snite from The Fountainhead, where he'll pick what he feels like. Maybe he'll pick Rourke, and for the others he doesn't care, or he'll pick somebody else, and it's just a hodgepodge. So I'm getting into the verge of being complimentary to say that that's a mixed case, because usually it falls outside altogether. Now, when confronted with a mixed case, you have to identify it as such. And then, if possible, place it within the dim category that captures what is most distinctive to it, and therefore what is most culturally influential. Because that's what we want to know, not the old stuff that we knew was in play, but what did this person introduce that was new and influential? But sometimes it's impossible to identify a product's essentials. Sometimes the contradictions, we have no quantitative measure of this. The contradictions are so balanced or so profound that the work literally adds up to nothing. By that fact, of course, then it has no epistemological meaning, even if it's very accomplished or popular. It just has to be disregarded as a cultural factor. The winners of the battle are never the mixed cases, but those with a total and wholehearted commitment. And this applies fully to the battle that we are concerned with, namely the one that goes back to Thales. So let's state the battle in the broad terms of the ancients, the 5 contenders. I think I have a summation of this in that outline, but just for what it's worth, don't try and take this down because it'll drive you crazy, but it should give you an overview. The D1 type favors the many, but does not fully reject the one. It seeks to discover a many of unrelated ones. In other words, a series of mini-unities through the low-level concepts, each disconnected from the others. Now, the D2 rejects any form of the one, rejects integration as such, and accepts only the many. Now, I upholds a one, which is the integration of the secular many. That's the Aristotelian Objectivist viewpoint. M1 accepts the secular many but only on condition that we see that that derives from a transcendent one, which is what unifies it, and makes integration possible. And M2 rejects the many, like this is Plato, as illusory, accepting ultimately only the one as reality. That is not as hard as it sounds, but you have to keep it in front of you for a while. All right, now that's as much as I can tell you right now about what does dim mean. My next question then is, what is the dim hypothesis? Which is the title of the book. Now, the dim hypothesis is two related theses. And you can think of the first one as cultural, the second as historical, even though they're both in a way cultural, but it's a different focus. These I'll try to say more slowly. Now, we're always talking since the Greeks, because that's when philosophy began. No comments on the Babylonians and the Mesopotamians, and etc. The cultural thesis is, each cultural field in the West has exhibited up to 5, but no more than 5, essentially different trends, which are defined and made intelligible only by their mode of integration. In every cultural field, I say, there is up to 5, but no more than 5 possibilities. And it is only the mode of integration underlying each that makes it intelligible. In other words, the dim categories exhaust the alternatives in Western culture and enable us to identify their intellectual roots. And that is, part 2 is devoted to that. And then the other one is the historical thesis, which argues that the changing influence of the various dim modes across time. In one period, I rules. In another period, M2 rules. In another, D1, etc. For reasons, obviously, that I'm not going into now. But the changing influence of the various dim modes across time is a fundamental cause of the progression of Western history. The changing influence of the various dim modes across time is the fundamental cause, or a fundamental cause, of the progression of Western history. In other words, if, as a hypothesis, you could take each successive, Greece, Rome, medieval, Renaissance, 17th century, etc., and show by a dim analysis that they came under one of these 5. And you could then show that the next one came under a different one, and that there was a logic, and that that logic was continued all the way through, then I would consider that that is a validation of the historical interpretation, and that would, of course, be the means by which you would say, well, if this is where we are now, and this is the story up to now, and these are what causes the changes, where are we going? And then you'd have to look around and see, and I think, unfortunately, there's some evidence. To put it briefly, the hypothesis as a whole claims that the dim modes give rise to the contending trends within our cultures, and that the succession of these modes governs the course of the centuries since Greece. That's part 3, does the history. Now let me explain some of the wording here. I say up to 5 trends in a cultural field, and that's assuming that the field has been discovered and pursued. If physics hasn't yet been discovered, then there's no dim involved. I say up to 5 rather than invariably 5 because for different reasons the dim categories are not equally pervasive. Any given one may be represented in some eras or areas but not in others. This is obvious in dictatorships when men are not allowed publicly to pursue methods of thought condemned by the state. But it may also be true in a free country because cultural products do not spring up automatically, not even when their mode of integration is dominant in the culture. To originate a mode's application to a specific field usually takes effort, knowledge, and some form of independence. It takes a certain kind of innovator, and you can't assume or expect that kind of person to appear instantaneously in every culture, everywhere. However, I think that for my hypothesis here to be convincing, if there is a missing product in some field, it's my obligation to characterize what it would be if it were here. And I'd have to do it by comparison to and contrast with extant products in the field. I'd have to be able to make its distinctive attributes clear, so at least to the extent that you could see, oh yes, it's a possibility within the field. It's not any of the others. It comes under so-and-so. That's what dim would be in this field. If I could not do that, if all I could say in some field is, well, there's 4 and I have no clue what the 5th would be, then I basically am subverting the whole thesis and leaving it vague and inconclusive. And yes, and inconclusive, but happy to say that I can do it. Now, when I say that there are up to 5, but no more than 5, obviously I'm talking about essential distinctions between trends. And that depends on your concept of essential. I've already explained the objectivist interpretation, both in regard to basic philosophy and modes of integration. By contrast, a champion of D who would read my book, which you wouldn't, but who rejects the very concept of essential, would say that's ridiculous to say there's 5. There's dozens or even hundreds of viewpoints in any field, because to him, disagreement among thinkers, whether profound or trivial, is all that counts in distinguishing one viewpoint from another. Now, on the other hand, a champion of M would say, what do you mean by 5? There's only 2 possibilities. Either you are oriented around God or you're some kind of secular materialist. That's it. And whether you're a positivist or objectivist, it's all the same, secular humanism and corruption. So obviously both of these approaches are incompatible with my hypothesis. Now, turning to the historical thesis, I want to make a few clarifying points. I speak of the dim modes and ultimately their creators or representatives as the cause of historical development. But I want to clarify, I don't mean that behind the various dim products, one always finds as the prime mover Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Descartes, or Comte. Now, in regard to any of the products in the big 3 modes, M2, D2, and I, Plato, Aristotle, and Kant, they definitely go back to the 3 towering archetypes. And M2 in any field is a Platonist, although he may hate Plato. And he says he hates Plato. And I is an Aristotelian, and a D2 is a Kantian. That you're always safe to say. But in respect to the 2 variants, that is not true. I chose Descartes and Comte as the main spokesman of these two variants because they give us a fine, detailed, clear statement of the essence of each. But this does not mean that the later champions of these variants, even if they're very philosophical, are necessarily produced by these thinkers. The men who define a method of thought are not necessarily the cause of its spread, not in this case. Comte and Mill and Descartes and Spinoza are not in any way comparable to the big three in terms of stature, prestige, cultural pervasiveness, or enduring influence. They are names, but they're not mega stars. Further, as we know, D1 and M1 are blenders. They combine elements taken from opposite giants. And there are several different possible forms and justifications for such blending that someone could offer. Even though for all of these people the resulting mode of integration is the same, therefore their advocates may very well invoke underlying philosophies which are quite different from anything put forward by Descartes or Comte. Now, a good example here would be the ancient Stoics, who were certainly not influenced by Descartes or Spinoza, were thorough M1s and anticipated Descartes on all essentials. So the fact that I chose those two does not mean in the case of the variants that you can say to somebody, aha, you're a positivist. Not every M1 is a Cartesian, though all of them are a distinctive but not purely Platonic kind of rationalist. And not every D1 is a positivist, though all of them are a distinctive and not purely Kantian kind of empiricist. Now, a few more points of clarification here. I describe, we're going to the historical thesis now. I describe dim modes as a fundamental cause. Now, why don't I just say the fundamental cause? I don't know of any other such cause, but ignorance is not an argument. I have no way of proving that modes of integration, however crucial in man's mind and life, are the only fundamental cause of a culture. Now, I cannot prove that they are the only intermediary between basic philosophy and cultural creators. In other words, that they are the only mechanism of philosophy's power over men. So I have to leave the question open. If later thinkers discover additional causes, that will not contradict my own conclusions, because new knowledge does not contradict that already one. So I want you to know what I am and am not saying. But on the other hand, I can't say maybe they will, because I have no basis for that either. So according to Objectivist epistemology, I just say, I'm claiming what I know I can establish. That's it. I'm not speculating whether there are or not going to be, brilliant people coming later who say, this is all just a drop in the bucket compared to the truth. Now, I want to stress also the word hypothesis. Why do I say the dim hypothesis? Why not the fact if I'm convinced of it? The reason is that it is a broad generalization, obviously, about all culture and all history. It's suggested to me by a philosophy, but I do not make any attempt to demonstrate it by deduction from any philosophy, including objectivism. In other words, you cannot think of my book as a long syllogism like this, : integration is the essence of thought. Thought is what determines culture and history. Therefore, integration is what determines culture and history. That is not my method of reasoning. That is pure rationalism. And if that's all I said, that is devoid of content. It's just the manipulation of floating abstractions. Now, you know, the history of philosophy is littered with that. Hegel deduced, apart from observation, that there could be only 7 planets. I think it was a week later they found the 8th. Leibniz deduced that this is the best of all possible worlds just before the Lisbon earthquake and the mass slaughter that it caused. Now, I don't want to be in that category. One cannot deduce the nature of cultural products or historical eras from a knowledge in the abstract of modes of integration. Products and eras are concretes. They have to be observed and analyzed before they can be categorized and explained. So without a fund of factual data, unanswerable questions abound to bedevil any general theory on the subject. How do you know your theoretical categories are actually operative in a given field or era? Maybe you have misinterpreted or misapplied one of your guiding abstractions. If you don't study specifics, how do you even know what form a given mode would take in various fields? If you don't study the fields, how would you know, well, D1 in education, oh yeah. What is it? Philosophic principles do not answer questions like these. They cannot tell us the difference between the curricula of a D1 and an M2 school, between the events in an I1 and a D2 novel, between the absolute ruler of an M1 and an M2 society, between the dominant mode of 5th century BC Greece and that of 21st century AD America. And it's just parallel to the law of causality. You cannot deduce specific causal relationships from knowing that everything has a cause. And the same is true of a mode of integration. You cannot deduce its application to specific intellectual endeavors. Otherwise, it's empty. If you try that, you will end up with somehow or other, I know not where, dim is there behind everything. And that's just as disreputable as saying God is behind everything. Now, I don't deny that any inquiry of this scale requires a theory to guide it. If, having studied many types of products in many fields, we knew nothing to guide us in interpreting our observations, our study would have led us merely to cognitive chaos. So here is where theory is invaluable. It enables us to conceptualize our data, telling us what is essential in the facts we've gathered, what relationships among them to seek out, what information might be there but overlooked, what principles can help bring all these data together. Such integration enables us finally to understand, for instance, the schools and the other trends in the different fields that would otherwise be unintelligible. So philosophy has a role, but the role is not to tell us what is going on. My method in this book is not deduction, but induction, as you would probably suspect. In other words, reaching general conclusions by abstracting from observed concretes. If the induction proves to be valid, then I will say my theory is no longer a hypothesis. But that is someone no one can know at this point. True, the hypothesis has been suggested to me by established philosophic knowledge going back to Thales. But that is not good enough. In philosophy, as in all science, reality has to have the last as well as the first word. Now, just there's still more. what am I going to take as typical, a representative of a culture? Obviously, I can't take every field of study or achievement. There's maybe 50, 100. I have selected 4 fields that I regard as representative of a whole culture, and therefore as reasonable test cases for the dim hypothesis. The trends in each of these fields, I hold, are a telling barometer of a culture's state and an eloquent omen of its future. 2 of these fields pertain to individual thought and reveal the modes of integration practiced by men who create their products alone. 2 pertain to social action and reveal the modes practiced by men whose joint product is the policies and behavior of large public institutions. Now, for the first 2, I've chosen fields from the broad area of arts and sciences, because apart from the professional schools, these constitute the entire college curriculum, and therefore the whole intellectual life of the society. In art, I have chosen literature, specifically epic poetry, plays, and novels, because that is the only art whose medium is concepts, words, and that's the only one capable of providing explicit, incontestable evidence of a culture's issues, conflicts, and methodology. Also, the only art which covers everything, rather than just one aspect or one theme. In science, I've chosen physics because it deals with the broadest principles of the material world and thus provides the base and method of all the others. Now, in regard to institutions, I've chosen the fields of education and politics. Education, I mean only K through 12, because I don't care what they teach in colleges, that's just ideas. I'm interested in cultural products that come out of the people who leave colleges. So education means the kids in grade school. What is done to their minds by the time they get through high school? That's what changes culture, not the stuff that they then dribble out in answer to their professors. And politics, I think, for obvious reasons, you cannot know the nature of a culture if you have only happy people teaching and writing and so on, and you leave out the guns that are held to their heads. And I think, in fact, the practitioners of education and politics, more than any others, directly impact every member of a society and do so continuously from birth to death in a way that even art and science don't. Now you could say, yeah, aren't there many other fields to which your hypothesis should apply? And I say yes. It applies to the entire realm dealt with by intellectuals, particularly the broader aspects of that realm. And that would subsume the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. In a single volume, of course, it's impossible to cover all this material. And I think it's also unnecessary. Because the other fields, however interesting, introduce, as far as I can tell, nothing new in regard to the method of a dim analysis or to its results. And I think once you get the hang of what we're doing, you can look into any of them and see if you can, you'll see, I think, that you can apply dim just as well. Now let me say that although the dim applies to many human endeavors, it does not apply to all of them. Even talking about absolutely legitimate endeavors and moral people performing them. An example here would be the creation of material wealth by entrepreneurs and industrialists. Now I know what Ayn Rand has shown in Atlas Shrugged, that such creators are men of the mind, that they produce wealth primarily by a process of reason, and therefore they're guided, at least implicitly, by the teachings of Aristotle. Though there's no doubt that their material products are spiritual and even philosophical. Despite the above, however, and this could be a controversial point for an objectivist audience, although self-evident to a leftist one. Despite the above, however, there is a crucial difference, crucial to our specific inquiry, between cultural and material products. Both types of products are the result of some view of thought, but only the former literally embodies and broadcasts it. A material object as such does not deal in or present viewpoints. It cannot be identified in terms of them. It cannot communicate them. Now, by a process of reasoning, counting on a whole system, a philosopher can infer the ideas of a material creator and the intellectual meaning of his work, which Ayn Rand did. But no one can reach these ideas simply through knowing the product, however thoroughly. In the cultural case, however, no equivalent inference is necessary. The meaning is available to anyone who intelligently studies the product. And even if, as sometimes happens, not very often, the material creator is voluble about his ideas, his product itself is mute. So his statements are not part of a product defense combination. A cultural product, by contrast, always speaks volumes. Both types of product, in short, depend equally on philosophy, but only the cultural product tells us, at least in essence, what that philosophy is. So in any contest for influence between the two, only the cultural product can win. Contrary to Marxism, economics does not move the world, nor does production, however great. And the strongest historical fact attesting to this is the horrendous status developments occurring during and after the fantastic achievements of the great capitalists. They had transcontinental railroads, you know, and the other side had the social gospel, is a few religious nuts and its equivalent. And they took over completely and now rule the railroad. Now, if the railroad, by riding in it or looking at it, you could get the equivalent of Atlas Shrugged, then there would have been no question, but that's the whole difference. You have to read Atlas Shrugged, or go to school, or read the novel. But just reading it, the railroad will not defend itself. And here's some contrast. The schoolrooms of the progressives, as against those of the traditionalists, concretize and disseminate a new view of thought, instill it in the child's mind. And the triumph of that approach has had a great impact on the nature of American culture. The same is true of the physics of Heisenberg as against that of Newton, or the novels of Joyce as against that of Hugo. There is no counterpart of these cases in the realm of material production. No change in the factors which change the very course of a country. We have a magnificent industrial development going in a completely anti-industrial direction. And I want to show you this on this example. The automobile replaced the horse and buggy. The computer drove out the typewriter, among who knows how many other things. Each of these achievements is certainly revolutionary. Each has changed just about everything in our lives except the nature of our culture and the direction in which we're moving. The automobile takes us much more rapidly to destinations much further away, but it cannot tell us what destinations are worth reaching. A work of art, however, can. The computer makes 1,000 tasks, including communication, easier, faster, cheaper. But the hard drive or the mouse does not tell us what to communicate. But the grade 5 teacher does. If a dictator were to arise to power in America, the source would be our culture, not our technology. Because dictators have arisen throughout history, no matter what the state of their era's technology. Eons ago, people installed their ruler by clubbing senseless his bearskin-clad enemies. Today, maybe we could do it or help it by sending mass emails through our cell phones. The material means are utterly different, but what is being done, and probably even why, is the same. Now, another point. There's another reason why DIM is inapplicable to the so-called material professions. And that is that the practitioners of the latter must have, by the fact that they are in that field, some rational perception of reality. Both D and M exponents are evicted from this type of area on purely practical economic grounds. These fields have a special concern with the concrete and the practical. Whether, they're pulling teeth or running a bank. And in these fields, a man's performance can be judged on or relatively near direct observation. Everyone, for example, can see and feel the negative effects of a bad dentist. So there is no M or D dentist. No dentist who functions, at least not for long, by ignoring individual teeth in order to treat the mouth holistically. And there's none who casts aside medical and dental principles on the grounds that every tooth is unique. Now you contrast this with the freedom, in quotes, of a philosopher, whose ideas, practical results, virtually no one even knows what they are, because he's dealing on so high a level of abstraction. Such a man can and does embrace and spread whatever mode of integration he chooses, and he can do so lifelong, seemingly with no penalty, and even with great popular and financial success. Now again, I repeat, the fact that certain fields exclude D's and M's does not mean that the successful practitioners are therefore I's. Though all I products are rational, not all rational products or their creators, as we've already seen this, are I's. Unfortunately, the great majority of rational producers, whatever their implicit ideas, have avoided the whole subject of philosophy. And they have thus excluded themselves from any dim status. Now, I'm saying that the exclusion of material fields does not affect the validity of my thesis, but it's because those fields don't affect where we're going, what we're trying to do. And now, just to start my program, which will begin next time, to introduce it, I'm going to start by analyzing Western culture, modern Western culture, and where possible, after it starts to develop, more specifically modern American culture, for the obvious reason that my ultimate aim is to get to where America is going. And then in the third part, I go all the way back to Greece and pick up the whole story. Now, we have to get the time scale of analysis here. No culture can be understood by looking at the fads or trends of any one season or decade or generation. Because that kind of myopia would ignore any cultural seeds that are sprouting but not yet dominant, and any old forgotten roots that are still germinating out of sight. If we look only at the trees and not the forest, it leaves us no way to know the influence or duration of any given tree or patch. So, for me to take what I regard as an appropriately broad view, I'm taking, and this is the narrowest broad view I can think of. I'm going to start by focusing on the 4-century period, which we call the modern world. In other words, from the 17th century through the present. During the Renaissance, the dominant sentiment was that men must escape medievalism, relearn the ideas of the ancients, and start life afresh. And I'm assuming we've reached that point in history. A break with the millennium of darkness, and then starting with the 17th century. I'm going to take each field and start with what was the dominant trend in the 17th on through the present, in the actual chronological order in which they occurred. So if we get to the end, and only the essential trends that are recognized to dominate, not just a small, not just Wales, and not just 1830 to 1840, but a whole century, and basically all of Western Europe and America, as they develop. And if at the end of each one we see 5 distinct, which correspond to the 5, then that's some evidence. Now, I do the 4 fields, but I'm not doing physics, because as you see, I can barely do what I'm doing here. But we'll start next time, therefore, with education, beginning with 17th century or classical education. See you then. Okay, questions? Yes?
Yes, my question is in reference to your earlier discussion of integration and perception. Could you comment on the source and or the justification of the objectivist description of perception as the automatic integration of sensations in the brain?
Well, the only thing I can say, that has nothing to do really with my lecture, because I'm concerned with I'm concerned with integration on a conscious level. I learned that from Ayn Rand, not from psychology, or not from observational study. And basically her argument was that the primary form in which we have contact with reality is perception. And that we know the validity of directly. We do not perceive sensations. And we don't obviously perceive abstractions or concepts. We then form concepts, that's the next step. And then by using concepts, we are able to analyze our perceptions and say that, we must have got sight at one point without touch. Unless you were hypothesizing that we get every aspect of every object instantaneously, which is obviously not true. So we go back and say, although we cannot now perceive the world on a sensational level, given the separate nature of our senses, we must have got the data in separate chunks and then put it together. But we could not put it together by inference because we don't have the conceptual level at that stage. It must be by the brain. That's all I want to say about it, because that's really outside the province of this class. There's a lot of books on it.
Yes, that's actually the problem, because the actual theorists that I've seen that advocate that kind of viewpoint do it from a Kantian framework. That is, they believe that the brain or the mind imposes structure on the data of sense. So
Well, no, I don't believe that at all. I told you what it is.
Yeah.
It's inference, it's not structure. Yeah. Sir, yes. Oh, I can't see her. Would you wave your hand? Yeah, okay.
Hi. Is it possible that the dim hypothesis can be applied to the practical science of, I guess broadly stated, how to achieve health? So
Health?
Health. Like in medicine, you have Western medicine, you may have Christian scientists that have a mode, you may have holistic, you may have tribalistic, shaman-type medicine.
Yeah, mystic medicine, okay, yeah. And the idea is the body as a whole, rather than focusing on the parts. You mean that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had that in one early version, but it seemed to me a little stretched because the only example, first of all, medicine. Well, no, not really. I was going to say it's restricted to held down by practical results, but that isn't true because there's such a big psychological component that if you have faith in the doctor, that often produces the results. So in that sense, the medical doctors are not really held down to reality, not in the way that dentists are, where it's a concrete issue. You could certainly say there is an Aristotelian type of medicine and there's a mystic type of medicine, which is defended in terms of holistic, that's, the parts are insignificant and all you want to treat is the totality. And presumably you know this by something other than observation. So but the question is, in trying to work that out, the only thing that I could come up with for D was excessive improper specialization. In other words, the doctor who said, I'm interested just in the pancreas and that's my life. Or I think there's doctors who are interested in the left ear and not the right. And that's my lifetime specialty. And they know everything conceivable. And that, you're going too generalized if you do both ears, let alone ear, nose, and throat, and so on. I don't think that's a trend, though. Specialization is necessary in medicine. And the internist specifically is there as the integrator. And he sees himself as playing the role of putting together the data. And the specialist is glad the internist is there, so it's a division of labor. I don't see any D as a dominant. I'm sure there are some, corrupt doctors, but I don't think they're a cultural trend.
Okay. Thank you.
Over here, yes. Just wave your hand, yeah.
Yes, sir. This is just an editorial or typographical comment, but as someone just coming to the hypothesis in the last week or so and learning it, I noticed that you assigned the numerical subscripts with 1 being to the variant and 2 being to the archetype. And to me, as coming to it as a new person, I had to make a little extra mental effort to get that straight. And it might have been clearer to me since the archetypes are both chronologically and intellectually.
Yeah, the thing is this,
prior.
though, I introduced them, and I want them to be the extremes, and the other to be in the middle. I don't want it to be D1, D2. It sounds, I see your point. It's easier to see 1 and 2, but I don't want any implication that 2 is a derivative or it follows from or whatever. So I don't want to give 1 primacy. I see, that's a good point. But over here, yes.
My pre-question is, I agree with him. I always have to do a mental conversion to do D2 equals D. But anyway, that's not my question. That's not my question. My question is...
If you do it long enough, you get used to it.
You can do it. Practice. Could you elaborate on a phrase? In the definition of the dim hypothesis, the historical thesis, you say that the historical thesis then asserts that the change in influence of the modes across time is a fundamental cause. In that you insert a conditional. The thesis then asserts that if culture is destiny,
Yeah.
the change in influence of the several dim modes. Can you explain that conditional if culture is
Yeah, I left it
estimated?
out in the lecture. Did you
I
know-
noticed.
You notice that? Because it sounds like I'm deducing it from that principle, and I'm really not. I'm saying let's look and see what the development is from one culture to another, from Greece to Rome, etc. And then we can decide, is culture, in itself, the factor that moves history? So
Should that be excised?
it should be excised.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
In my own defense, let me say, I guess there's no use saying it, but this script that I read has been edited twice. I would never publish anything, never. Certainly not a book that hadn't been edited 8 times. So when the book finally comes out, it will be recognizable, but it will not be the wording. You don't really see the full implications of every word till you go over it from every different aspect. And at a certain point, you start saying, well, why do I need this phrase? In OPAR, I had one whole editing from beginning to end just on the words and or. And every one of them said, do I really mean conjunction and or alternative? Or like often I use or as synonym and I cut that. He's rich or well off, and I cut out that. And you have to go through, but phrases in commas, in a cultural context, for the present, in a sense, etc. Get a special editing and get killed as much as possible. Or you can't think or write early as tersely as it finally has to be. Yeah.
Hi, I want to start by thanking you for this lecture and all the wonderful work you've done over the years. I can guess the answer to this question, but I'd like to hear it from you explicitly. Why have you decided to spend your time developing this hypothesis now over some of the other sorts of things you could have done, like developing some of the epistemological leads that you mentioned in OPAR that Miss Rand left when she died?
Well, I have a really a full and honest answer to that, which is I am not interested in epistemology. I came to philosophy exclusively through ethics. How should you live? What was moral, etc. And then one night, Ayn Rand said to me, you've got to start learning metaphysics and epistemology. And I said, why? What difference is it going to make? So we had an actual conversation. I said, as an example, who cares, whether space and time is infinite or finite? You still have to be honest and productive. And she gave me a long analysis of what difference it would make to the things I cared about. So I went to graduate school, and then I saw, that they were shooting down everything I believed in ethics through metaphysics and epistemology. So I said, okay. So I learned that, because I realized you have to, but my real interest always was the direct influence of philosophy on life, on values. And the others just insofar as it goes back to that. And that's why both the ominous parallels and this book are concerned with culture, with history, with how do people live differently as a result. Now, OPAR is the only exception, and that was basically paying back a debt. Since Ayn Rand taught me the whole thing, I've got to give it, write it out. So there, I gave epistemology, but when I finished, I said, thank God, I don't have to deal with that anymore. And when I finish this one, I'm finished with philosophy. I will never write on philosophy again, if and when I finish this book. And what I actually have in mind to do is write a novel, because that's a different way of, well, thank you. I doubt that you'll get to read it. But that should answer you. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I hate doing research. I don't like broad. I don't mind metaphysics, but I hate epistemology. The worst thing is to teach concept formation to freshmen.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes.
I won't be able to reconstruct this as you said it, so I'm hoping you'll recognize it. But in a previous day's segment this week, you said something about that a person cannot necessarily integrate everything, can't integrate every piece of knowledge. It may not be relevant to his other knowledge. I wondered how that relates to the idea that all knowledge is interrelated.
Okay, well, let me try and answer that. First of all, I think you're referring to my statement that not everything we know is relevant to everything else. If you're engaged, like if you're doing an experiment, and one of the things you have to do is hold the relevant factors constant. You have to be able to say, well, the heat, the age, the material, etc., is constant, but I don't care whether my aunt is giving a party or how cold it is in Canada. That's irrelevant. So in that sense, you can only do science if a limited number of things are relevant to any given topic. But there's also something broader to this, which I tried to cover under the unity of knowledge. You integrate all knowledge into a unity, all of it, through the unity of knowledge. That is, through the unity of the filing system, the accessibility of any given file when needed to all the others. But it doesn't mean when you say all knowledge is related, it does not mean, for instance, we will necessarily someday be able to integrate psychology to physics. There's a lot of psychophysics and so on, but it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to take, the movement of subatomic particles or electrical impulses in the brain and relate it to the emotion of fear. And vice versa. You might find some correlations, but you might not. Or take biology and astronomy. You might find, that there's some connection of energy between the two, or you might find there's some special life element that there's no counterpart to in astronomy. In other words, Hegel would hold that any part of the universe entails the totality. So if you start with a marble rolling, and if you knew enough, everything in the whole universe would be knowable from that fact. And I don't believe that's true. I don't believe there's any evidence for that. And I don't think that's inherent in integration, as I've just said. If you hold that out as the model of integration, you're going to quickly give a tremendous ammunition to the D side. They're going to say, well, if that's what you think you're going to do, if that's what integration is obviously some kind of mystic irrationality. And therefore say, this marble is this one, and this marble is this one, and there is no connection between the two. Those are the only 2 points I can think of that you made. Does that answer you?
I think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
I once wanted everything to be connected to everything. And I think I even worded certain things like that, but hopefully they're vague enough so that... Yes, yes.
You made a distinction between cultural products and defenses of cultural products.
Yes.
Aren't defenses of cultural products a kind of cultural product? Mm-mm. And if so, what is the distinction?
The distinction is a thing versus talking about a thing. A novel versus discussing a novel, defending it. There are people, for instance, who defended naturalism, literary critics who wrote in newspapers. And that's just one example. And they said this, or the authors themselves very often. Sinclair Lewis, a lot of them write essays and make speeches by this is truth and not the fantasy, of the romanticists. We don't have only beauty because life has ugliness, etc. Now, without these people, we are the representatives of reason, they say, whereas the romanticists are only the representatives of emotion. If you didn't have that, if they just turned out the books without explanation, analysis, or defense, naturalism would never have caught on the way it did. On the other hand, if they just simply made speeches in class, they went around saying, we should have novels that do this and that, and there weren't any, then I'll have no influence. So you definitely need the combination.
Thank you.
You have to wave your hand if you're there. Yes?
Dr. Peikoff, is the dim hypothesis a sort of application of philosophy? Is it,
Yeah. It is. It's an application of broad philosophy to what I regard as the essence of cognition. But you don't have to know it to know, like objectivist epistemology. I didn't put it in. And I wouldn't put it in even if I knew it. I mean, Ayn Rand defined objectivism. She did a perfectly good and complete job of analyzing philosophy without having this idea. So in that sense, it's an application. Yeah.
Is it sort of a new aspect or a new?
To me, it is. Now, I've had people tell me, oh, it's really, so and so and so and so. There's nothing new about it. And I grant you that dividing philosophic views or answers into three categories, there are many, many, many such trinities that you could be offered. The intrinsic, objective, subjective, or two reality, one reality, no reality, Platonic idealism, etc., etc. And in a way, they're all related, but I think they all give major clarification from their particular aspect. And the only thing I have on them is they subdivided two of them, so I have 5. So I would like anybody to go through these fields in 4 centuries with just intrinsic, subjective, and objective, and tell me how you classify, where you find it, and I maintain you won't find it. But integration is something, for one reason, the representatives have no problem with saying what their views are. If you tell them, we want to know which schools are rational and which aren't, with the exception of the D2s, they'll all say, of course we're rational. We're the representatives of rational. But if you say, what is your attitude to integration? They'll say, either they'll say, that's ridiculous, or, that's unscientific, and whatever they call it, irrational, and it doesn't make any difference. They are telling you what their actual view is. So it's much easier to get these movements to define themselves if you do it through integration. That's what I found anyway. Than if you do it through the standard, even empiricism and rationalism doesn't do it because there's radical differences in rationalism and in the products that they bring out, as there's radical differences between John Stuart Mill and Ulysses, James Joyce. There's huge differences. And to say, well, they're both empiricists, it just doesn't catch it. Anyway, that's a boast, and you'll have to see one half of the argument, but the really important half, it has to be another time. Are we finished? Okay, thank you.